Hi everyone. Today we will be covering marine and freshwater livelihoods and the ongoing histories of expropriation and criminalization.
We felt that the overall themes of our presentation were captured well in this quote given by the Chiefs of Ontario, which states that we will not continue to be made the poorest of the poor while all around us people use and exploit our resources to enrich themselves at our expense.
We argue that settler colonialism is a process that advantages non-Indigenous communities and economies at the expense of Indigenous communities and livelihoods. One way this manifests is through the ongoing criminalization and expropriation of marine livelihoods. This is important as it demonstrates how settler colonialism is not a historical event, but rather a set of relationships that continue to exist in socio-legal structures and political relationships to this day. Addressing settler colonialism in institutions involves getting beyond the duty to consult and integrate Indigenous knowledge into modern policy, but rather incorporating governance and co-management with Indigenous communities.
Okay, so we will first start off by discussing the historical aspects of criminalization and marginalization by highlighting the traditional relationships that exist between Indigenous communities and their lands, followed by focusing on significant treaties that demonstrate the ways through which this relationship was embedded through settler colonial influences. Following this, the presentation will focus on the Micmac fisheries case studies, which will exemplify the modern ramifications of historic treaties and settler colonialism. Finally, our presentation will conclude with identifying ways forward, including the importance of Indigenous environmental justice, going beyond the duty to consult, and using two-eyed seeing as a means of co-management.
Before we begin, let's contextualize the histories and ongoing appropriation of marine and freshwater livelihoods. Our presentation will focus on marine and freshwater livelihoods, specifically looking at fishing and fisheries. This is a prominent issue that impacts the ability for Indigenous communities to access resources like fish on their own land, while non-Indigenous corporations and individuals simultaneously benefit from their commodification and consumption. Additionally, it is important to note that while fishing has incredibly important cultural and social connections, Indigenous communities have also long had vast, substantial economies and trading systems spanning across Canada, making them an integral part of self-sustenance and sustainability. This is one issue that concerns Indigenous nations all across Canada. However, a prominent example relates to the Micmac First Nations community, which we will discuss in theme 2.
So our first theme will explore historical treaty relations, and understanding history in this case helps pinpoint settler colonialism and selective interpretation of treaties as a key process that has abstracted power away from Indigenous communities and towards the benefit of crown economies. And these economies flourished with the commodification of native resources. So specifically, we will look at the process of settler colonialism and how it facilitated a transition from treaties as a tool of alliance to a tool of colonial resource dispossession. So relations between Indigenous communities and newly arrived Europeans were characterized initially by strong trade and military alliances, where the assistance of Indigenous communities was really essential for the survival of European populations. And treaties made during this time were done so with the intentions to maintain peace and friendship between Indigenous and European communities. So a prominent example of this was the 1764 Treaty of Niagara, which aimed to promote mutual collaboration between the two communities, where neither community absorbs the other, but neither community stands alone, as quoted by Mills. This treaty is significant to understanding that Indigenous communities were recognized as their own nation who had sovereignty, rights, and responsibilities over their own lands, and they were never intended to be viewed as a symbol of giving up or surrendering their land. So the following era of treaty making highlighted how treaties transitioned from a tool to form mutual alliances as shown by the Treaty of Niagara, to a tool that could be used for asserting settler colonial power and taking advantage of Indigenous resources. So this increase in power was due to a growing settler population, a new mainstream economy that did not need the support of Indigenous communities, but rather access to their lands and resources like water and fisheries instead. And this was followed by the growing ideology that European society was superior to Indigenous communities, which added a further layer of assimilation and dominion over land when negotiating treaties. So the dominant settler colonial ideologies played a key role in interpreting treaties differently as well, starting off with the Treaty of Niagara, where the original promise of protecting native lands was sort of morphed by a settler colonial perspective into being interpreted as a treaty that validated the need for assisting assimilation into Western society. So overall, one key narrative that emerged from these treaty interpretations pertained to treaties being used as evidence that Indigenous land claims and titles were extinguished and land and resources were surrendered. And this interpretation disregards the important role that treaties played in cementing and symbolizing an ongoing relationship of coexistence. And by understanding a settler colonial perspective, we can understand how treaties were not only broken or dishonored, but rather selectively used and interpreted to place more power in the hands of settler society and their control over Indigenous resources. So one prime example of settler colonial power dynamics influencing the process of treaty making and interpretation are the numbered treaties. So these are a group of 11 treaties that were created between 1871 and 1921. And the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada recognizes them, and I quote, large surrenders on a huge scale. Along with other political institutions understanding the numbered treaties as historical events in which Indigenous peoples are said to have consensually ceded and surrendered title to the land. So through these interpretations, treaties were reduced from a symbol of ongoing relationships to one that narrowly considered what rights were assigned to Indigenous communities by the Crown. So such treaties were used to justify assimilation policies, which prevented autonomous governing of native lands and prevented access to resources. So while Indigenous communities were given rights to continue fishing in these areas, these lands were no longer considered theirs. And these treaties illustrate how settler colonialism and racist ideologies allowed non-Indigenous societies to manipulate and use to their advantage these socio-legal tools that further marginalized Indigenous communities and their access to resources. The Huron Tract Treaty is another example of how diverging interests between First Nation communities and settler societies allowed treaties to be selectively interpreted in order to favor mainstream economies. So British settlers viewed such treaties as purely transactional in order to gain control over land and resources at the lowest cost possible. And this resulted in allocating extremely small portions of land for reserves and exclusive use, with the intention that Indigenous communities would eventually decline in population and would not need to occupy large areas of land. On the other hand, Indigenous worldviews never really viewed land solely as a commodity, but rather an essential part of survival, community, and culture. And this process of marginalization and sidelining restricted access to resources like hunting and fishing, further taking power away from Indigenous communities and placing them in the hands of settler society. And these resources were essential for prospering Indigenous economies and communities. And as stated by the Ipperwash Inquiry, Volume 2, in the terms of this treaty and many others like it lie the seeds of disappointment and discontent of succeeding generations of First Nations people. So in 1868, the Fisheries Act was established, and this allowed for legislation to pass which placed regulations on Indigenous fisheries while heavily favoring the expansion of non-Indigenous fishing enterprises. And this demonstrates how resources were more easily expropriated by the settler colonial society. So Supreme Court decisions like the 1990 Sparrow decision that acknowledged the right of First Nations in British Columbia to fish for their own food, and the 1999 Marshall decision, which established the Mi'kmaq fisheries had treaty rights allowing them to engage in commercial fishing, eventually resulted in amendments being made to the Fisheries Act. And while these amendments translated to including Indigenous knowledge systems and treaty rights, there was little effort made to change the modes of governance. And the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is actually still not required to incorporate Indigenous communities in governing and managing fisheries. So this speaks to a continuing settler colonial narrative that was demonstrated in previous treaties as well, one which regards Indigenous communities as external to mainstream economies and water governance, preventing them from fully benefiting from the resources that are part of their lands. And as the Fisheries Act states, non-Indigenous fisheries were supported and expanded at the expense of Indigenous ones.
Okay, so for theme 2, we will be using the Micmac case study as an example to portray the ongoing conflict regarding criminalization and appropriation of freshwater resources between Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous agencies. The Micmac Indigenous people are a First Nations population residing in the Atlantic region of Canada and continue to practice their traditional, historical, ceremonial, and cultural practices within their communities. They have been relying on natural resources for many, many years, and thus these resources, including water, are essential in their day-to-day lives. One of their main uses of water is for fishing purposes, which would sustain or contribute towards their livelihood and has been practiced for decades. The ongoing conflict pertains to Indigenous harvesters who are fighting for their rights to fish, and commercial non-Indigenous fishers who are worried about their livelihoods. Recently, non-Indigenous commercial fishers have expressed frustrations with the idea that moderate livelihoods has not been specifically defined by the government, resulting in several acts of racism and violence against Indigenous Mi'kmaq fishers. These fishers felt as though the Mi'kmaq should not be allowed to fish during commercial fishing seasons. One of the main legal framework in place to protect Indigenous livelihoods is the Marshall Decision, which was made in 1999 and acknowledges the treaty rights of the Mi'kmaq to hunt, fish, and gather in pursuit of a moderate livelihood. The case was made in light of criminalizing Donald Marshall, a Mi'kmaq fisher, who was fishing without a license, and at that time, this was considered against the regulations established in the Fisheries Act. However, following this case, the Supreme Court clarified that provincial governments are at liberty to regulate how the treaty itself is implemented, noting the need to balance economic interests with Indigenous rights. This emphasizes the settler colonial narratives described in theme 1, wherein treaties are used as a strategic tools and implemented under certain interpretations by the settler colonial government, indicating how the jurisdictional systems ultimately serve to support settler colonial populations, while Indigenous ones are disadvantaged.
This has imposed challenges for the Mi'kmaq community and their water-related traditions and practices. Additionally, their accessibility to these water territories is threatened through government-imposed regulations and restrictions. In the case of the Mi'kmaq communities, Mi'kmaq rights, according to the Constitution of Canada, remains unsolved and undefined, which demonstrates the lack of validity and legitimization of these rights under the Canadian jurisdiction system. This demonstrates a settler colonial perspective that does not acknowledge or validate Indigenous rights and legal systems within settler institutions. In the case of the Mi'kmaq, their rights were never truly considered as an entity that should be incorporated into the Canadian Constitution. However, the Mi'kmaq continue to assert that their rights are inherent and are protected by treaties. Settler colonial legal systems have hence not taken into consideration the inherent rights of Indigenous communities when crafting their laws and have only been recognized through treaties, which have different meanings today. This has allowed for the continued expropriation of their resources.
Another case study that also faces similar challenges in legal battles regarding water governance are the Katasu people located in British Columbia. Despite the existence of treaties that were established centuries ago, government authorities and policymakers continue to produce laws and regulations that affect and most often may prevent Indigenous communities from accessing nearby water sites. In the case of the Katasu people, fishing regulations such as fishing closures and restrictions have been introduced. However, the Katasu leaders continue to resist and challenge these regulations. In some cases, indigenous communities have their own set of regulations and protocols put in place when it comes to harvesting and fisheries in their territories. However, due to the emergence of external agencies wanting to govern and regulate water sites, indigenous rights to their land and resources are ignored through these practices. The Canadian Fisheries Act serves to conserve and protect fisheries, which at the same time can overshadow and undermine Indigenous regulations and protocols. Despite the aforementioned amendments made to the Act, by not enforcing regulations on Indigenous governance, the amendments remain largely symbolic in nature and may translate to little material change. Policymaking does not necessarily support the protection of Indigenous rights to land, instead may support the practices and ideologies of the settler colonial population, furthering the expropriation of resources. For example, requiring a license to fish will continue to place Indigenous fishers at a risk of criminalization.
So despite the existence of the historic rights and regulations of the indigenous populations to land and resources through treaties, it has become more and more challenging to accommodate these treaties with the contemporary and modern set of regulations set in place by governments and policy makers today. Historically, indigenous rights have been ignored through colonization, which further questions local and national policy reforms and regulations indigenous communities face today. Water governance is one of the major issues surrounding the Mi'kmaq and other indigenous communities, as there are multiple parties that are wanting to gain access and control of these waters. Different ideologies of waters can further lead to the issue of water governance, as we see through the example of the Mi'kmaq and Kitasu examples.
Are the non-Indigenous groups who perceive water as a resource for different purposes and functions which align with the ideologies and practices of settler colonialism? Non-Indigenous actors in this case vary from corporations, industries, the government, and policymakers, and non-Indigenous ideas on water and its uses could vary from political, economical, and environmental purposes. With non-Indigenous parties, the intentions and goals for governing or accessing water territories can vary from resource extraction, urbanization, and for industrial purposes to create pipelines, for example. It is also important to understand that non-Indigenous views and practices of water and land resources can also often be regarded with monetary or profitable goals. Non-Indigenous groups view water as a necessary to conserve and or to be used as a resource for extraction purposes. This further enables the intrusion of the spaces and lands of Indigenous communities without regard for their existing rights to these land, further undermining previous treaties that protect their land, which goes beyond drinking water and freshwater resources, as these water sites serve multiple purposes and functions for the Aboriginal communities, whether it be for sustaining their livelihood and for spiritual and healing practices, which policy reforms fail to consider when they impose closures and restrictions on certain water sites. The Indigenous population also perceive the value of water as one of the fundamental tools that contribute to their well-being. These differences influences the legal, social, and economic disputes regarding water governance. Government policies do not often align with the needs of Indigenous communities, as they may impact their access to certain water sites, which they may rely on for livelihood purposes and for traditional and cultural practices. Due to the power settler colonial society holds, it is often these conceptions of water that end up being centralized and inform the mainstream policies. It is also important to critique these dominant approaches to the decision-making process. One example of this connects back to the Huron-Tract Treaty, where viewing land as a commodity resulted in disregarding its other holistic purposes and uses for Indigenous communities. Additionally, the Ipperwash Inquiry states that failing to acknowledge the differences in perceptions of water is a key reason why Indigenous rights are not fully acknowledged in regards to resource management and land development.
So when developing within an indigenous place, we can draw from the case study of the Mi'kmaq nation that works to revitalize the place of Nedakulamik, a concept that embraces cultural and spiritual connection with resource stewardship. that exercises the rights to self-govern their fisheries management. In 1999, the Unacademy Institute of Natural Resources, also known as UNIR, addressed the concerns of 5 Mi'kmaq communities that regarded the natural resources and their sustainability. As UNIR emphasizes on the spiritual elements of resource management by identifying the interconnections between people, animals, plants, and environments, they utilize science research with Mi'kmaq knowledge. This essentially is what Nitu Kumlik hopes to embrace the collaboration of fisheries and environment with health sciences that can be critical to the development for Indigenous knowledge translation and capacity building. Two-eyed seeing is a capacity building strategy that is exemplified within the framework of Nitikulumik. It essentially provides a decolonizing approach for knowledge creation, mobilization, and translation through taking the best of both Western and indigenous worldviews. It would delineate a coexisting and co-learning framework, quoted by Macmillan. As the goal for two-eyed seeing is to generate an integrated, sustainable fishery management program that would allow both Western and indigenous worldviews to integrate knowingly, there are 2 centrally oriented recommendations to go about the capacity building strategy framework. First is to put traditional knowledge into all aspects of community life, including economic development, fisheries, health, social, law, environment, and education. The second recommendation would be to encourage the use of traditional knowledge to inspire younger generations to learn about and respect customary practices and law and spiritual performances, which include language related to hunting, fisheries, and food gathering. So to conclude, lands, resources, and self-chosen governments that reconstruct social, economical, and political order are what is displaced in our discourses today. As we have demonstrated how fishery management has lacked legitimization for Indigenous groups, we should direct that control over resources owned by Indigenous communities to allow them to govern and feed themselves in order to self-sustain and not rely on government handouts, which have been known to negatively impact their health and well-being, both in a physical and social manner. By going beyond the duty to consult, we would need to further understand Indigenous repercussions, such as fishery management, which has been vital to Indigenous communities everywhere. Additionally, the Ipperwash inquiry has pointed out that co-management that primarily focuses on consultation often involves Indigenous communities too late in the process to make substantial changes, and that simply incorporating Indigenous knowledge into policymaking is not effective if that knowledge is not paid attention to and held in the same regard as Western knowledge.